honor it is to be here tonight. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Joyce. Thank you, Gard. It's a real honor to have heard all of you and to be here with you, and to the preparation of the listening that you provided here tonight. I think that when we open our hearts and do talk about things that matter, Martin Luther King said, your life begins to end on the day you stop talking about things that matter. And Americans are good people. I'm not saying we're better than other people, but we're certainly no worse than anyone else. And I think as Americans, we do care. All of us, we do care when we hear about these children. We do care when we realize that sex trafficking alone is a $91 billion industry in this country, that the Super Bowl is the world's largest sex trafficking event. We do care when we hear about these grandparents, which we absolutely know is a phenomenon all around us, but too often people feel paralyzed. And when Gard was speaking, especially Gard, when you pointed out the Dalai Lama's line, that if we want to be happy, we must have compassion for others. So many times Americans hear these terrible stories and we don't know what to do. Well, let me tell you something, ladies and gentlemen. Politics is supposed to be the conduit by which we do something. But what politics, however, has become something different in this country. Politics is supposed to be a healing agent, and in too many cases and in too many ways, American politics has become the purveyor of the disease. And that is what we need to talk about. This is our business. The Latin word politics doesn't mean of the government, it means of the people. And so much of what is happening in our country today, things that don't make any of us very happy, are happening like they are opportunistic infections. So many of the terrible things that are happening could only have happened because we had a weakened societal immune system. You and I are the immune cells, and in too many ways we have been disengaged from politics. In too many ways we have just assumed that other people were handling it, hoped other people were handling it, figured, well, I'm not political. If you were living in this country, you are political. And you are either exercising your political responsibilities proactively and in a positive way, or you are falling for the myth of neutrality. And like they used to say when I was a kid, if you're not part of the solution, you are part of the problem. So the days of coddling within ourselves or other people, this chronic disengagement, too many people are acting these days like the whole thing is so traumatizing what is happening. It's just so traumatizing. Well, ladies and gentlemen, none of us have time. We don't have time for you to get over your trauma work before you show up for your country. This stuff is happening. It's got to end, and that means you and I are on. One of the things that Gard said tonight was, these children don't vote. You better believe it, and that's what's going on here. We have millions of American children living in chronic trauma, and yes, it has been pointed out to you already, many of them are in Nevada, but they're in every state. I heard a public school principal here in Nevada at one of our last gatherings say that she has elementary school children on suicide watch. And when she said to the state of Nevada, I need a social worker here at our school, was told that a social worker was not available because their school, where they have elementary school kids on suicide watch, is not one of the worst situations. We have 41 million people who are hungry, who are food insecure in the United States, and that includes many of those children. How are we to expect children to learn to read and learn to write when they're hungry when they go to school? But let's talk about how it's even worse than that. Let's talk about the fact that many public schools in America don't even have libraries. Let's talk about the fact that millions of American children go to school every day in schools that do not have adequate school supplies with which to teach a child to read. And if a child can't read by the age of 8, the chances of their high school graduation are drastically diminished, and the chances of their incarceration someday is drastically increased, which is then where you get so many of these grandparents raising children situations. These children live in chronic trauma. We have millions of American children who live in what are called America's domestic war zones, where the violence in their homes, their families, their schools, their communities is so great, such as the violence of these children who are being pimped, where the violence is so great that they are experiencing, according to psychologists, PTSD that is no less severe than the PTSD of a returning veteran from Afghanistan or Iraq. But if a veteran has PTSD, it's post-traumatic stress. These children, it's present traumatic stress. It is triggered and re-triggered every day. This is the humanitarian emergency in our midst, and we should be rescuing these children. As Amy is trying to rescue them, as Joyce is trying to rescue them, as Gard is trying to rescue them, we should all be rescuing them, no different than if they were victims of a natural disaster. But let's talk about the fact that our political system does not rescue them. It normalizes their despair for the reason Gard said. They're not old enough to vote, so there's no constituency there. They're not old enough to work, so there's no financial leverage there. And if there's no financial leverage, you get nothing from our Congress and you get nothing from our White House. Why? Because we have become a system of legalized bribery whereby the opportunity for real people, the citizens of the United States, and let's not kid ourselves, these children, they are full-on citizens of the United States. What possible chance do they have to compete for their rights, their inalienable rights to life and to liberty and the pursuit of happiness in a situation where they can't possibly compete with the clout of multinational corporate forces whose money flood our Congress and flood our White House every single day? None of this is going to stop until we, the people, step in. Ladies and gentlemen, we're on. But it's not going to happen unless we say so. It is not going to happen unless we intervene. It's not going to happen because of some incremental changes here and some incremental changes there and a few policy changes here and a few policy changes there. We need to address the fundamental problem, ladies and gentlemen, and it ain't on the level of the symptom and it's on the level of the cause. It's not on the level of watering the leaves, it's on the level of watering the roots. And if we're going to do that, we're going to have to get real and we're going to have to get honest and we're going to have to be really, really self-aware as a nation about what is going on in this country and how corrupt the whole thing has become. It has become so corrupt, we need public funding of federal campaigns, because until then, advocacy for the people of the United States will be secondary, will continue to be secondary to advocacy for short-term profits for fossil fuel companies and health insurance companies and big pharma and gun manufacturers and defense contractors, because the bottom line is that our government does more to advocate for the rights of those who already have a lot to get even more, and for those who hardly can make it to have an even harder time. Either our government is of the people, by the people, and for the people, or let's just face it, let's be honest with ourselves, and we're acquiescing to it becoming a government of a few of the people, by a few of the people, for a few of the people, of the corporations, by a few of the corporations, and for a few of the corporations. Ladies and gentlemen, the people need to intervene. The people, let's be honest. By the way, just to be clear, this is not an anti-wealth or an anti-rich communication. That's not what we're talking about here. It's beautiful that people can make money in America, and there is such thing as righteous commerce. The problem is not that some people can make money in America. The problem is that not enough people can make money in America. The problem is not wealth. The problem is not wealth, the problem is aristocracy. Aristocracy is where your government functions in a way to make it easier through tax cuts, through corporate subsidies, through financial deregulation. All this that has been going on for 40 years makes it easier through policy for those who already have a lot to get more and for those who can hardly make it to even survive. That is why we have 1% of all Americans owning more than more wealth than the 90% bottom of the rest of America. That is why we have the largest income inequality in almost 100 years. That is why we have 40% of all Americans struggling to make it. And that is the petri dish out of which all this dysfunction arises. So we have to address the cause. We have to address the fact that the United States has swerved. We have swerved. We have swerved from democratic values. Late Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis said, you can have large amounts of money concentrated in the hands of a very few, or you can have democracy, but you cannot have both. So, ladies and gentlemen, we need to recognize that money in politics is the cancer underlying all these cancers. We need to step in. The people are on. And if you make me President of the United States, the first thing I'll do is I will send to Congress my proposal for legislation to establish public funding for all federal campaigns so that the government of the United States is returned to the people. to expect the political establishment to do this. The political establishment sucks on the tit of that corruption every single day. And the idea that only those people whose careers have been entrenched for the last few decades in that system that drove us into this ditch are possibly the only ones we should consider qualified to drive us out of this ditch is preposterous. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the people to step in. And when the people step in, we recognize that, yes, the trauma of these children, it cannot be addressed by ignoring it. We need, it was already mentioned, I think Joyce mentioned it or Amy mentioned it, and if you make me president of the United States, we will have a cabinet-level U.S. Department of Children and Youth. If one person, we need wraparound services, we need anti-trauma, we need to consolidate all this information about what's happening to these children. We need to give law enforcement the necessary resources they have to protect and to save these children. We need conflict resolution, we need restorative justice, we need mindfulness in the schools, we need to deal with the fact that 41 million Americans are hungry. We need to deal with the fact that we're the only advanced nation in the world that bases our education funding primarily on property taxes. So if a child wins the birth lottery when it comes to financial advantage on the part of their parents, then that child is likely to get a very good public education in America. But if that child did not win the birth lottery when it comes to the money that their parents have, then they're liable to be left in a situation where the United States of America is what we are giving up in lost revenue. If you want to talk about this in economic terms, we can talk about it in economic terms. We are losing billions and probably trillions of dollars in lost revenue because we are not actualizing the potential of the brains of our 5-year-olds. If you want to see the entrepreneurial spirit in America, you go to any kindergarten in any neighborhood in any city in this country. That's where our genius is. That's where our potential is. That's where the neuroplasticity is. That's where the cognitive retention is. That's where the cognitive plasticity is. We are ignoring these children. Why? Because we have an economic system that has nothing to do with planning for our economic good 10 years from now, 25 years from now. No, it's all about sucking from the system right now, short-term profits for the health insurance companies, for the banks and the financial institutions, for Big Pharma, for gun manufacturers, from defense contractors, and like I've already said it, this won't stop until the people step in. So if we really want financial good 10 years from now and 25 years from now, I'll tell you what we do. We take better care of our 10-year-olds today. And that's why if I'm president of the United States, there will be a massive realignment of investment in the direction of children 10 years old and younger. It is time, and they are citizens of this country too. We're a good people, we're a decent people. The problem is not that we're not good and not decent. The problem is that we have become a society in which too many of us, when we think about goodness and integrity and character, which I think we do, we think about it in terms of our private relationships. But we've gotten out of the habit of thinking of these things in terms of our public relationships. We need to ask more than whether or not I'm a good person. We need to ask, is America good? And America will not be great again, Mr. President, until we're good again. And in order to be good again, we need to take a deep look at where we're not. If one person neglects children, we consider them unethical at best and a criminal at worst. So what do you call a society that systematically neglects these children? No, we need to look at that. That's why we need a cabinet-level department of children and youth, and we need to address this crisis in our midst. But we also need to take what is called in AA a fearless moral inventory. America can have anything. We can be so amazing in the 21st century, but not unless we're willing to clean up the past. If you're going to take a serious moral inventory, you have to take an honest look at yourself. And you need to look at, among other things, what your character defects are. The United States has to look at our character defects, ladies and gentlemen, and this has to start with a couple of them that have been with us from the beginning. Racism has been with us from the beginning. And even though we have had generations rise up, we've had generations rose up, they abolished slavery. We have had generations rise up, passed civil rights legislation, passed the Voting Rights Act, desegregated the American South, passed the Voting Rights Act to give black people equal access to the polls. We did that. I'm not trying, none of us should, minimize the sacrifices, the struggles, and the successes of any of our ancestors. But ladies and gentlemen, there is still work to be done, And in some ways, when it comes to race, we're actually sliding backwards. Mass incarceration means we're sliding backwards. Racial disparity in criminal sentencing means we're sliding backwards. Voting suppression efforts that have popped up ever since in 2013, the John Roberts-led Supreme Court began chipping away at the Voting Rights Act means we are sliding backwards. No one thing is going to fix it. We need an integrative politics. We need to address the internal issues as well as the external issues. But when it comes to the economic restitution, the economic gap that existed at the end of 2.5 centuries of slavery, and then another 100 years, which would be called in today's terms a time of domestic terrorism, the economic gap that started at the beginning, the first days after the end of the Civil War, where not only was there this horrifying gap, obviously, because how were former slaves supposed to make a living? They were promised at the time by the US government 40 acres and a mule, which most of the times they did not get. Even when they got it, most of the times it was taken away. Once the federal troops left the American South, most of the Southern legislatures passed what were called the Black Code laws to ensure subpar economic, social, and political opportunity for black people. Even in the years after that, when groups of black people would rise, when they would create wealth, so many times local governments would actually thwart those plans. Ladies and gentlemen, Germany has paid $89 billion to Jewish organizations since World War II. It doesn't mean the Holocaust didn't happen, but it has gone far toward reconciling Germany with the Jews of Germany and the rest of Europe. In 1988, Ronald Reagan signed the American Civil Liberties Act, whereby we gave to every surviving person who had been a prisoner in the Japanese internment camps during World War II. Each surviving prisoner was given between $20,000 and $22,000. Nations make mistakes just like people make mistakes, but you clean it up. You do what you can. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give this great gift to our children. Let's pay reparations for slavery. Not only in terms of African Americans, but we need to deal with the fact, as a generation is ready to do, that's the beauty of this. The beauty of this to me is the fact that I'm in Nevada and you just applauded, and they applaud for reparations in Iowa, and they applaud for reparations in New Hampshire, and they applaud for reparations in South Carolina, and they applaud for reparations in Ohio, and I'll tell you why, because the American people are good. But our political establishment just panders to popularity. It doesn't want to say anything about what's really right. It just wants to say something about what it thinks might make you vote for them. Ladies and gentlemen, the people have got to step in. We have been trained to be followers, not leaders. They're supposed to follow us. Let's take it from here. It's time for the people to step in. And we need to deal with reparative measures towards Native American tribes in this country, where you see the greatest level of poverty, where you see the greatest level of injustice. There are reparative measures that we can make there, starting with giving back the Black Hills of South Dakota and dealing with all of the various ways, whether it has to do with the Keystone Pipeline or any other way, in which through lawsuits, through treaties that we did not honor, treaties that were unfairly negotiated to begin with. You make me president of the United States. I'm going to help this country clean up its past so that we can open up to the most magnificent future. And there's one more area that we need to talk about very seriously and very soberly and very intelligently, and that is our national security agenda. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we all know we don't have universal health care because it might cut into the short-term profits of the health insurance companies and big pharma. And we don't adequately deal with the climate crisis. Why? Even though it's the greatest moral challenge of our generation and could possibly imperil the survival of life on Earth. Why? Because it might cut into the short-term profits of fossil fuel companies. We don't have reasonable, common-sense gun safety legislation. Why? Because it might cut into those short-term profits of those gun manufacturers. And we do not have an agenda for waging peace on this planet. We don't have a peace-creating agenda. We don't have an agenda that says this is how our children are going to live in peace on this planet 5 years from now, 25 years from now, 50 years from now. Why? Because to do so might cut into the short-term profits of the defense contractors and nuclear industry. How immoral and sick is that? Once again, it's time for the people to step in. Donald Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense for George Bush, I remind you, said we must wage peace. You have one of the great peace pioneers here in the room, Susan Beaver Thompson. You should be very proud of her here in Nevada, one of the great peace journalists in this country. We have James Mattis, who was at the Defense Department. Before he left, he said, if you're not going to fully fund the State Department, I'm going to have to buy more ammunition. Now, to what was he referring? Well, the State Department theoretically is about humanitarian efforts. It's about diplomacy. It should not go unnoticed that in the current administration, the first Secretary of State was the ex-CEO of Exxon. What is wrong with the American people that we didn't shout in a guffaw that was so huge you could have heard it all the way on the other side of the world? That means that you're not using your State Department for humanitarian purposes. You're not using your State Department for issues of diplomacy and building a greater peace in the world. You are using your State Department for advocacy for huge multinational corporations such as Exxon so that they can make more money. How wrong is that? Or as Chris Rock would say, that's not right. That's not right. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for you and me to take it from here by you and me knowing what's really going on here. And that is that we must wage peace, as even Donald Rumsfeld said. So I want all of us to be very clear what that looks like and what it means. There are 4 factors which, when they are present, statistically are proven to decrease violence and conflict and increase peace. And it's not going to surprise anyone what they are. Number 1, increase economic opportunities for women. Number 2, increase educational opportunities for children. Number 3, reduce violence against women. And number 4, ameliorate unnecessary human suffering wherever possible. Desperate people, hello, do desperate things. Desperate people are more vulnerable to ideological capture by genuinely psychotic forces. That is true whether you're talking about a corner of the United States where people are more vulnerable to gangs, a corner of the world where people are more vulnerable to terrorist organizations, or anywhere in this country or anywhere where people become more vulnerable to authoritarian demagogues. Get it? We got a problem here. It's time for the people to step in. Rather, what do we have? We have a government that, for the sake of $100 billion in arms sales to Saudi Arabia, are willing to actually give aerial support to a genocidal war by which the Saudi Arabians have starved. That war has caused the starvation of tens of thousands of Yemenis, many of whom are children. Their pictures are all over the internet. The good news is it was a bipartisan effort, Democrats and Republicans, who sent to the president a bill that said, you've got to stop. You cannot be part of this. And he was able to override it. Oh, as our current Secretary of State says, you can have strategic partnerships with people who do not share your values. You know what, ladies and gentlemen? No, you can't. It means you have sacrificed your values. You make me president, we will have moral leadership in this country again. The world will no longer roll its eyes at the even idea that the United States is a moral leader. We will again at least try to be who we say that we are. That is the way our children and our children's children will have even a chance of peace on this earth. Right now, we have a situation where our U.S. Air Force has ordered 100 airplanes called the B-21 bombers. Just want to be sure that you know what the B-21 Raiders do. The B-21 Raiders each cost $550 million. And the thing about these Raiders that's quite unique is that each and every one of them is built to carry both conventional and nuclear weapons. Now, can somebody tell me why we need 100 airplanes that would drop nuclear weapons? Because you drop 5 of those, it's over for human civilization as we know it. You drop 10 of those, it's over for the human race on this planet for 200, 300,000 years at least. They know that. This has nothing to do with our national security, ladies and gentlemen. It has to do with profits for defense contractors and the nuclear industry. Meanwhile, 41 million Americans are hungry. Millions of American children are chronically traumatized. We have 40% of Americans who are struggling to make it. We do not have universal health care. We do not have a high enough minimum wage. Many, many American youth cannot get educated, and millions are burdened by these college loans. Why? Where are we going to get the money to pay for all that? I have an idea where we should get the money. Get it back from the people who stole it to begin with. That's what I say. So we need to repeal that 2017 tax cut. That 2017 tax cut, $2 trillion, 83 cents of every dollar went to the very, very richest and the very, very richest individuals and the very, very richest corporations. You repeal that tax cut. Put back in the tax cut for the middle class, I believe. That part was actually a good idea. Stop those ridiculous corporate subsidies. $26 billion to the fossil fuel industry alone, why? Martin Luther King said if they give it to the rich, they call it a subsidy. If they give it to the poor, they call it a handout. Ladies and gentlemen, the government does. It's not like the government doesn't help people. Oh, the government helps a few people a lot. And then those few people give all that money to those campaigns in order to elect people who will then legislate all those tax cuts and those corporate subsidies. Ladies and gentlemen, that's why we need public funding for our federal campaigns, and that's why we need to elect someone not only in the White House, we need to elect people in the House, and we need to elect people in the Senate who do not have moral equivocation about these issues. Incremental changes are not enough. It is not enough to just treat the symptoms. We need to realize the level on which we have become corrupted as a nation. And then on the other side of that, anything is possible. We can have anything. Where there is love, anything is possible. But some generations are called upon to rise up. A generation was called upon to rise up and abolish slavery. A generation was called to rise up and give women the right to vote. A generation was called to rise up and desegregate the American South. It's our time. Ours is a generation that is called. And I believe that ours is a generation that is ready. In the last 2 years, there's been a mass awakening in this country. Even people who thought, oh, maybe some other people are handling it, realize that they aren't necessarily handling it. But incremental change is not enough. We need a serious disruption of the status quo, because we now have a situation of such an unholy alliance between our government and multinational corporate forces as to mean that we are reverting to an aristocratic paradigm. Ladies and gentlemen, in 1776, we repudiated aristocracy, and we need to repudiate it again. As it turns out, the American Revolution is an ongoing process. We were born of rambunctiousness. We were born of a spirit that said, no way. We were born of a spirit that says, we don't just go along. We don't just do what we're told. That's not American. Americans don't just do what we're told. We do what we want to do, and we have a government that's supposed to help us do what we want to do, because that's our greatness. Our greatness is that we can soar. Our greatness is that we can spread our wings, and that should be the social contract between the U.S. government and its people, that you feel the government is on your side, not capping your dreams, helping you unleash your spirit. I want every young person in America to feel like your government is invested in you. I'm going to give you universal health care. Why? So that people can relax. So that people can relax and not live in this constant, chronic economic tension. What am I going to do if I get sick? What am I going to do if one of my kids gets sick? How am I going to pay for my kids to go to college? How am I going to pay off these college loans? Who can thrive within that? Who can spread their wings within that? But you let people thrive and you help people thrive. You know what? Let me tell you what happens. They become the men that they're capable of being. They become the women that they're capable of being. They become the people that they're capable of being, and then they go after it, and they build companies, and they're employees and husbands and wives and lovers and friends and parents that really are laying it down and doing great things and making a better life for themselves and the people around them. That is what makes America great. President, because I just was not going to spend the next few years yelling at the TV. I was not going to spend the next few years saying what you should say is, and I thought if nobody else is going to say it, I'm going to say it. And let me tell you something, ladies and gentlemen, you help me, I'm going to do more than say it. I'm going to go to Washington, and I'm going to do it. Ladies and gentlemen, let's love each other. Let's pray hard about this. Let's have some miracles, and let's kick ass. Thank you.